Your product metrics are only useful if they are tied to the right behavior and if they are measuring the right way. And that truth holds even for Mixpanel. In today's video, I'm going to be focused on measuring the right way using the Mixpanel Insight reports. Since my last series of videos on Mixpanel about a year ago, I've gotten questions from users asking for specific ways to measure things or answer product questions within Mixpanel, which is why I'm doing this video. In addition, ever since then, Mixpanel has made some updates to their user interface, which makes it a good opportunity for us to explore this further. And so this series of videos are exploring the Mixpanel Insights reports and specific ways to measure actual product questions with the Mixpanel Insights reports. Let's get into it. Unlike before, where the Mixpanel Insights report was based off of events, now the Mixpanel Insights report is based off of metrics. But what are metrics in Mixpanel? Metrics are a combination of events and how you choose to measure those events. In this video, I'm going to be touching on 5 specific ways to measure events. I'm also going to be using this example of a social app. So think about your typical social networking or social media app capabilities. You're able to sign up, you're able to like a post, you're able to make a post, you're able to comment, send messages to users and your friends. And so in order for us to explore the ways by which we measure, this is the example we're going to be using. Remember I said Mixpanel metrics are events combined with how you choose to measure those events. So let's get started with an event and explore the ways by which you can measure that event. The event we're going to be exploring today for this use case is like post. Again, think about your typical social media app where you're liking a post. When you select the event, Mixpanel provides you a default for how you can measure that event. Typically, it defaults to uniques. That is the first way you can measure an event, uniques. Uniques in Mixpanel explores the unique number of users that carries out this event. So in this example, we're looking at the like post and we're looking at it on a daily basis as a line chart in Mixpanel as a unique. And so the interpretation of this is that every day of this month, this number of unique users are liking a post. That is how to interpret this. So it's a distinct measure of users that like posts. Now, if a user likes a post more than once in a day, it only counts as one because that is unique to the user. That's the first way to measure. The second way you can measure an event in Mixpanel, you are able to access it by clicking the measure, and that is totals. Totals can be total events or total sessions. Total event reflects the total number of times that that event was fired by users or triggered by users. So for example, if I liked 10 posts in a day, my 10 likes account all together under the total event, because for each time I liked a post, I triggered the like post event. This is the difference between the total event and the unique event. For a unique event, a user only counts as one during the time frame that is being measured. But for the total event, it counts every time a user is carrying out this event. So the way you would communicate the unique is saying on December 9, 4,605 unique users liked a post. On December 7, 3,950 unique users liked a post. And in this case, we are not accounting for the number of times each user liked a post. We're just counting the uniques. The way you will communicate the total event in this scenario would be by saying on December 7, about 10,750 likes were given on this day altogether. So that accounts for all the likes given by everybody, irrespective of how many people. And so now you're beginning to see how these examples can determine how we communicate our product metrics. If you're interested in the number of users that are just liking a post, then you use the uniques. If you're interested in the entire number of likes that were given within the social media app by all the users, then you use the total events. Another measure that is very similar to the unique is total sessions, even though it's a total. The total session just understands a user session as one. And so if I like 10 posts within a session, it only considers that as a session. So the total session considers the user session and everything that happens within that session as one. So if I like 10 posts within a session, it only considers it as one. But if I log out of the app and I log back in within the same day to initiate another session and I like more posts, then it considers it as another session. In this case, the way you will communicate this metric is by saying that 5,890 user sessions had likes. And so now we see the distinction between unique users giving likes to posts, the total number of likes on a post, and the total number of sessions where there were likes. And so for the total session, if I log into my social media app and I didn't carry out a like, I just scrolled through without liking a post, then it doesn't count my session as a session that was involved in a like post event. And so these first three I would consider as simple, easy metrics. I should also point out that with the unique default to an interval, which measures the number of users that carry out that event on that specific day. However, you are able to also change these to daily active users, weekly active users, and monthly active users. Your daily active users measures the unique users that carry out an event in the last 24 hours from when you're measuring. Your weekly active users measures your uniques, but only based off of users that have carried out the event in the last 7 days, irrespective of how long you were measuring. And same happened with your monthly active users. It only measures the number of users that have carried out the event in the past 30 days. And the reason for this is if you are measuring for an event that happened a long time ago and you only want to see the people that are currently active at this point, then you can measure your uniques only based on your daily active users, weekly active users, and monthly active users so that you are able to filter out users that are not active. So that is the difference. So your unique by default shows an interval, but you're able to switch to your daily active users, weekly active users, and monthly active users. And this is a very simple, although ineffective way of measuring retention of your product. And so these first three, the unique users, total event, and total sessions, are what I would call the simple ways of how to measure. These next three I will consider a bit more complex, and I'm going to explain them. The next one is the frequency per user. The frequency per user starts to help you understand the distribution of an event across your users so that you understand depth of engagement or the spread of engagement. And so, for example, if you're looking at the average tells you the average number of like posts or the average number of events that your users carried out. So it's not enough to understand the total number of events or the unique number of users, but giving it an average for you to understand how engaged are your users on that event. And so in this case, the way you would read this or interpret this is saying, well, on December 9, we had an average of about 3.13 likes on posts within our app. So that's thinking about all the total likes divided by the unique users, irrespective of how many likes that the users gave. And so your frequency can also not only be an average, it can be a median, it can be a percentile, it can be a minimum, it can be a maximum. So if you're looking at minimum, obviously the minimum has to be 1 because 1 like triggers an event. But then by the time you are looking at the maximum, then you understand that the most people like a post 49 or 61 times. That is the maximum. And so this also helps you now to understand the depth of engagement, that the least person likes a post 1 time, but the most person probably likes a post about 69 times. So that helps to inform how deeply your users might be engaging with your product or with your feature. Frequency per user helps you understand depth of engagement or spread of engagement. The percentile is also a very good way to understand the distribution and the spread of how an event is carried out among your users. The next way to measure that we're going to be talking about is aggregate property. An aggregate property helps you to summarize or roll up a numeric property across your event. And so for this particular example, I'm going to change the event to send message. And that's because I want to get a numeric property. With send message, think about your typical social media app where people are sending messages, exchanging messages between one another. In this case, we're looking at the aggregate property, but we want to see what is the average of a numerical value that is associated with that event. And in this case, the numerical value that we are interested in is the message size, i.e. the number of words that are sent in a message, which happens to be an event property. And so in this case, we're looking at, for everybody that sends a message, what is the average of the message size? It's not enough that they send a message, but what is the word count? How many words on average are involved in the message that is sent? It's important that the numeric value or the numeric property has been captured as part of the event in order for us to aggregate based on that numeric property. In this case, message size words is the numeric property of send message. So the moment a message is sent, it's not enough that we know that the message has been sent. The implementation has accounted for the number of words that were included in that message that was sent. So every hi, bye, how are you, we're counting the number of words. And so now the average of that property measures the number of words that were sent on average. The way we would interpret this is by saying on average 450 words were sent in messages that went out on December 9. That's how we interpret this, just looking across all users. Now that we understand aggregate property as a way of summarizing, we should also note that for aggregate property, it doesn't only have to be an average. It can also be a median, it can be a distinct count, it can be a percentile, it can be a sum. It can be a sum of a numeric property, but an average is easier to explain for us. So depending on what you're trying to measure, if you're trying to aggregate or roll up or summarize a numerical property across all the user profiles, you use an aggregate property. The last advanced measure that I want to touch on is aggregate property per user. And this is sometimes confusing with the aggregate property. But with the aggregate property per user, it helps you to summarize, starting with the user first and then summarizing across all users. I will show us a very distinct example to illustrate this too shortly. With the aggregate property per user, you have to first aggregate on each user level for every time the user did that event, and then aggregate across all the users that carried out that event. And so in this case, using the send message example, we can still select, let's say, an average per user and then do another average by selecting the property. And so instead of just aggregating on average for every user, we are doing an average for a user first and then doing an average for every user based off of the average of every user. That was a mouthful. Let me show us a clearer example to illustrate the difference between the aggregate property and the aggregate property per user and how to measure those. This is a quick example that can help us distinguish between the aggregate and the aggregate per user way to measure a Mixpanel. In this example, I have three users A, B, and C. User A sends one message, user B sends 3 messages, and user C sends 2 messages. User A's one message has a message size of 20 words. User B's 3 messages have message sizes, the word count of 30 words, 32 words, and 34 words. And user C's 2 messages have word sizes of 30 words and 42 words. If we're looking at an aggregate and we want to aggregate based off of average, Mixpanel looks at all the messages that were sent all together, which is 20 words, 30 words, 32, 34, 40, and 42, adds it all together and does an average of 6 because there are 6 total instances. And so that's 33. So we are aggregating based off the total number of messages that were sent, which is 6 messages altogether across all 3 users. And then we have an average of 33. And so if we're using this example and doing an aggregate based on the message size, the average would be 33. But in the example where we're looking at the aggregate property per user, using this same example, Mixpanel first calculates the per user averages, which is the first criteria that you select, and then averages all of those equally. So with the property per user, you have to select 2 ways by which you want to aggregate. The first way, how to aggregate on the user level, and the second way, how to aggregate across all the users. And so in this example, we do an aggregate, which is the average for user A, 20, because they only sent a message with 20 words. For user B, they sent 3 messages with 30, 32, and 34 words. So we calculate user B's average, which is 32. User C sends 2 messages with 40 words and 42 words respectively, and so their average is 41. And so once we do the average for every user, we then do an average across all the users. And so because we have 3 users, we do an average for each user's average, which is 31. And so we can see the difference between using the same example but aggregating or aggregating the property per user first. And so the difference between the two is that for an aggregate property, we're doing a total sum divided by the total number of occurrence. But for the aggregate property per user, we are doing an average per user and then an average across all the users in question. And so for the first example, which is an aggregate, user B significantly influences this more because they sent 3 messages, and so they have more messages in the pool and more numbers for us to average by. But in the example where we're aggregating the property by user, each user contributes equally into the pool of averages, irrespective of how many messages that is sent. The only thing is we averaged for the users first before they got into the pool of total. And so this is how the differences work. Depending on the question that you're trying to answer, you can have different kinds of aggregates. And so the way we would also present these is that the aggregate helps us to understand the patterns across everything that was done for the event. But the aggregate per user normalizes it first so that one user is not over contributing than other users. And so that's the difference between the two. This is a highly statistical example or a highly statistical metric. And depending on the kind of product that you're working on, honestly, you may not even have to deal with the aggregate property or aggregate property per user ever or often, but this is highly statistical, and the nuances are there and can tell if you're working with events that users do so many times. A user could over contribute and other users under contributing, so you have to use the right aggregate. And so similar to what we had for the frequency per user as well, your aggregate metric can be a sum, can be an average, can be a median, can be a percentile, a minimum, or a maximum. And so depending on what you're trying to get, if you're looking for the minimum number of messages or the maximum number of messages that you want to aggregate, let's say for the message size, in this case, the maximum 1702 words on December 9. And the same vein as well, you can use the same types of aggregates for the aggregate property per user. You can also have like a maximum and even choose a minimum if you will for the same numeric properties. And so a very good understanding of what we're trying to measure or understand from the product's point of view is what would help you choose what you want to measure in this case. But I'm giving us these illustrations, especially with the previous example I gave, for you to understand if you're really curious about what should be the message limit based on the events that my users have done in the past, so that we just don't allow as many words as possible. This is when you start to use this to understand, okay, the maximum that users may have sent is this, or the average that users have sent is this, but the average across all users is this. So we can safely assume that our limit should be between 35 and 40, something like that. That is how you use these metrics. A very quick summary of everything we've said so far in this video. One is that Mixpanel Insights reports measure metrics, and metrics are a combination of events and how you choose to measure those events. In this video, we talked about 5 different ways to measure events. One is uniques, that tells you how many unique number of users carried out an event, irrespective of the number of times that those users carried out that event, as long as you're looking at uniques within a time frame. The second way to measure that we touched on is total events, which cumulates every single time every user carried out that event within that time frame. We also talk about total sessions, which is closer to unique, that understands the number of sessions within which events were carried out. Those are the simple ways to measure. Now to the advanced ways to measure. We talked about frequency per user, which allows you to understand the depth of engagement and understand the spread of engagement by way of averages, distribution, percentile, depending on what you're trying to understand. We then talked about the aggregates and the aggregates per user. These two aggregates are basically ways to summarize or roll up numeric properties for an event. With aggregate property, we are able to only summarize or roll up based on the number of times that that event was carried out and the numeric property that is associated with that event. We use the illustration of sending message and the word count for each message that was sent. But the aggregate property per user normalizes that numeric property for each user first before aggregating across all users, so that one user is not over contributing into the pool compared to other users. And for both aggregates, you're able to also measure based off of any kind of aggregates that you're interested in, be it a summary, an average, a distinct count, minimum, maximum, percentile, to your heart's delight. So once again, with the right product question in place, you understand how you can answer those questions with these measures and metrics in Mixpanel. As always, I always indicate that you must have captured the event and the event properties right in order to be able to use Mixpanel this way. But if coincidentally you have not captured all of these properties and all of the events in a way that helps your analytics, honestly, today is a good day to start. But until when you start capturing those events, you may have to rely on proxy events or close enough events and event properties in order to answer your product question. I hope this was helpful for you. If you have any questions, feel free to send me an email or reply in the comment section, and I'll get back to some of those questions or make a follow-up video to clarify some areas that may not be clear enough already. If this has been helpful to you, feel free to share with your product manager friends, and I'll catch you in the next video. Bye.